Alec Show podcast.
Smart Alec Show, baby!
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us today. Today on the pod, we've got a very special guest. He hails from Germany, studied business in undergrad in the States, and has 2 master's degrees, right? With one being a master's of science in HR management that he got in the Netherlands. Another being a master's of education in sports management that he got at UT Austin. And the cherry on top, hence why he's addressed as the Honorable Dr. H. He studied at UT Austin, getting his PhD in sports management, where he now also lectures at UT on complex topics such as sports finance at the graduate level, a true expert within his field of sports management and sports finance. It's my honor to welcome Dr. H onto the pod. What's going on, man?
Thank you. That I think I might have to make that mandatory watching for all of my future classes, so people get into the right mindset. That was awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me. Super excited.
Yeah, no, get them hyped up. I'll definitely send you the file afterward. You know, there you can throw it into your introductory PowerPoints and whatnot from there. It's hard for some of my guests sometimes, like yourself. I try to do my best to throw in a nice, powerful intro in there to do you guys justice for all the cool things you guys have done. But right off the bat, man, so you're from Germany. Were you a big Dirk fan growing up, with Dirk being the best German basketball player ever, arguably the best European basketball player ever? Luka will eventually take that, and Dirk has already, given it to him. Like, Luka's already better than me, but for the time being, Dirk, in my opinion, I'm biased as a Mavericks fan, but huge Dirk fan. I think he's the best European ever. But were you a huge fan of him growing up in Germany?
So I'm actually old enough, believe it or not, to have grown up with Dirk's predecessor, Detlef Schrempf.
Okay.
He used to play for the Sonics when the Sonics were still a thing in Seattle, right? With Gary Payton and Sean Kemp. So that was kind of my go-to when it came to Germans making it in the NBA. So when Dirk really blew up, when did he get drafted? Was it like 2001? Is that right? Something along that?
Well, he retired in 2019. I know he played 21 seasons, so it must have been
98 even. So in the late 90s. Yeah, I mean, I was 13. I had already sort of picked my favorites at that point, right? But yeah, for sure, like always followed, especially with the Mavs. The way that I got like introduced to the Mavs was with Triple J, right? Jamal Mashburn, Jason Kidd, and Jimmy Jackson, I think, right?
Yeah. I've heard the legends. I was a little bit before my time, and I've heard the legends of the Triple J.
Yeah. So then when Dirk went to the Mavs, it was like, oh, that's exciting. Should be a good run. And yeah, he's good. I mean, he's an all-time great.
Yeah, sure. No doubt. It's they kind of messed up with Dirk in terms of letting Kidd go early in his career, letting Nash go right before he went into his prime with the Phoenix Suns. And then, later in Dirk's career, we kind of tried to put it back together. We got one title out of it, but my hope and my belief is that they learned from that, 21 years of management style with Dirk, and they'll capitalize on Luka's, next 10 years of greatness. Hopefully. It's surprising we made it to the conference finals. I didn't think we could get through the Suns, but it kind of looks like, in 2007 when LeBron led the Cavs single-handedly all the way to the finals just to get swept by the Spurs. We're in the process of almost getting swept by the Warriors, so we'll see if we can, hold on a little bit longer. But it's been a good run either way.
It takes time, and I'm sure, as you said, I'm sure there's some institutional knowledge at this point in terms of how to make sure the gears are all clicking, and having somebody like Luka, of course, on the team, and trying to figure out how to move the pieces around to complement that appropriately.
No doubt. No, it's an exciting time for the sport, for the NBA in terms of international players, whether it's Jokic, Giannis, Luka, etc. So it's cool to see the international growth, and it's wild to think that you can make an argument that maybe 3 to 5 of the top 10 players in the league are all, you know, international superstars. But did you always know, Dr. H, that you were going to be an expert in this niche space of sports management, or did it just happen? Or how'd you get here, man?
So the road was a winding road, right? So when I was in high school, I had no intention to ever be in education. So I really enjoyed high school from like a student perspective.
Mhm.
But it also always came very easy to me. And I couldn't imagine teaching something and being the person trying to teach somebody something and the other person not immediately kind of getting it, right? So I was always that high school student, you know, hardly had to study, did very well very easily, which then proved to be very difficult once I went off to college. So
Yeah.
I was actually a very poor undergrad student, believe it or not, because I just couldn't that step up, right? That was just
Yeah.
way too much for me. Hardly ever worked in high school. And then I went to college to a pretty good business school. And all of a sudden, everything was just 10, 20 times more difficult. The workload was just insane all of a sudden. And of course, there was a little bit of, you know, structure missing. You know, you live at home, you got schedule, you got
Yeah.
practice, you got school, things are sort of like laid out for you, right? And then all of a sudden, that sort of goes by the wayside a little bit. So I didn't, right? So poor undergrad student, barely made it out, right, out of my undergrad years. But at that point, late during undergrad, I already kind of realized what I was really interested in was trying to help people do well. Be that in life, but also at that point, really looking at helping people do well within organizations. So I've always been interested in, you know, organizational behavior, organizational psychology, right? How to get the best out of people within organizational settings. So that's what I really wanted to do at first. I thought I was going to do that at a company like cliche, you know, VW, Volkswagen, of course, right? My mom worked there for, I think, 30 plus years before she retired. Um, and then it switched a little bit. Then I started thinking, you know, of course, I had been playing basketball for a long time at that point. So I figured, well, I could work in sports, but still do the organizational behavior stuff. So I figured, well, I could do that at like a Nike, for example. Or if you look at, you know, the Mavs, for example, especially now after bringing Sid Marshall in and sort of professionalizing their processes a little bit, they have HR departments, right? They have people that make sure all the employees are well treated and, you know, all these things are in place. So I could do that at a Nike, or I could do that at, you know, the Yankees or the Mavs or any of those major organizations. So I went to the States, to Texas, for that master's in sport management just to get closer to the industry. So I was doing that. And then while I was a student, my professors kept telling me that I should think about getting a PhD and shifting the focus a little bit toward maybe approaching the industry from a teaching perspective. You know, of course, I could still do consulting if I wanted to, but based on my work in the classroom, which, sort of side note, right? Anybody listening who's a poor undergrad student, make it through and until at least you get to the classes in your major. Like, don't give up before you at least get a taste of the courses that are within that area that you at least think you want to be in.
For sure.
That was the case for
Getting
me.
through the weed out classes before you know, the
Yeah,
basics and all that good stuff.
yeah, because I did pretty well once I got to my HR classes during undergrad. That wasn't a problem at all, but sort of just getting to that point was just disastrous.
Just
So
quick aside as well. No, I totally relate to you in that sense. Like, and I know a lot of people are like envious of you saying like, you know, you didn't have to study that much in high school or this and that. So I didn't struggle too much in high school in terms of like, you know, I could get a decent grade without really having to study. So I never built those habits of how to properly learn and study. So when I did get to college, I got, hit by a freight train basically of like, I really struggled and almost didn't make it through in my first year at UT because I just had never built those habits in place of how to properly study and read and do this, that, and the other that you need to do in college that you maybe never had to do in high school. So I totally feel you on that front as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it was almost like it felt like I had been giving that chance getting out of undergrad alive. So then I really sort of doubled down with the first master's and then especially the master's at UT, to where my work in the classroom was so good that professors just kept asking, hey, like you really seem to kind of like have a knack not only for the content areas, but just for the processes of sort of like the classroom and understanding the procedures and everything that goes into doing well. So I kept saying no at first, right? Because I was kind of holding on to wanting to be in the industry. But then I kind of realized that sometimes we don't really notice our strong suits because we're in ways too close to ourselves, right? Especially if we have some sort of preconceived notion of where we want to go. And then I almost kind of stepped back a little bit and it's like, okay, well, like, what are these people actually saying? Like, okay, so you're good at, all these things that I had previously never really considered me being good at, writing, speaking, standing in front of people and delivering content in a way that makes sense to others, all the stuff. So once I sort of wrap my head around that actually being sort of a viable path forward, then I transitioned pretty quickly during the second year in the master's. And it's like, okay, well, let's kind of like take a look at this and what would the path forward look like? And then I actually got, scholarship to stay at Texas for the PhD and stayed on. And
Awesome.
well, here we are, right? Now, after 4 years in North Carolina, well, I guess physically I am still in North Carolina, but a bit of a hiatus teaching wise, now back where it all started, which is super cool.
How hard is that to get a scholarship to get your PhD? How is that common or how tough is that to pull off?
So sort of paradoxically, the money at the graduate level gets more easily available the higher up the ladder you move, in a way because there are fewer people to give the money to, and the stakes are also higher in terms of the universities getting more bang for their buck.
For sure.
So by giving somebody like me what essentially amounted almost to a full ride if you factor in like TA salary and all that stuff, right? And then full ride and then some even. They get, obviously, they get my work out of it as a teaching assistant, but I published articles, I went to conferences, and then once I graduate and I, go somewhere else where I then teach, obviously that's also marketing, it's branding.
Absolutely.
So it's sort of paradoxical if you think about it. There's fewer people, but then there's also more money, but then you also have to be really, really good within that smaller group of people. So it happens more often than you might think.
Okay. Yeah, no, that gives someone like myself hope where I'm like, I don't want to continue within the education space after I get my graduate degree. But then it's like, if there's money on the table, that's a totally different thing. But that's awesome. And that makes sense, even though it kind of seems ironic and kind of paradoxical, like you said, but the stakes are higher essentially in all facets of it. But that's awesome, man. So how hard is it to actually make a profit within the sports space? From the perspective of like, say I'm, Mark Cuban or Jerry Jones or whoever, right? And I'm running a pro sports team. How hard is it to actually be profitable within the sports space?
Well, I guess the first question you would have to ask yourself is, do you really want to be profitable? Mm-hmm. Is that truly the reason why you are in this particular business? And for a lot of professional sport team owners, the answer is actually, worst case, no, but best case also sort of, well, I don't really know, right? So I think we need to distinguish a little bit between making a profit on an annual revenue minus expenses type of level, right? So are you being profitable season after season after season?
Sure.
Or sort of the big picture, are you buying a team in the hopes of selling that for billions more than you originally bought it? So if you really think about it, if you think about the trajectory of team valuations, right, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, I mean, we're looking at teams being worth 3, 5, 10 times more today than what their owners bought them for decades ago, right? So you can lose a lot of money season after season after season if at some point you decide to sell your franchise for $5 billion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
I think Cuban bought the Mavericks for around 250 to 290 million, and I'm sure right now they're valuated around 2 to 3 billion. I presume. So you're saying even though you may lose money year over year, depending on the time trajectory of how long you've had equity in the team, depending on that, you may be able to, in the long term, come out at a profit despite in the short term continually having losses.
Yes. And that's assuming you even have a profit motive in the first place, right? There are plenty of professional sports teams that don't make money, technically speaking, just by looking at their income statements. But that's also not the point, right? If your personal wealth is 5, 10, 15, $20 billion, depending on who you are in the professional sports world, then losing the occasional 15, 20 million, that's not really the reason most of the time why you got into that space in the first place. When I taught undergrad sport finance, I would always sort of flippantly say, well, there's only so many Gulfstream 5s that you can buy, right? At some point, you just want to have a sports team. It's just that next level up, right?
Yeah.
There's only so many cars, there's only so many, pieces of real estate that you can buy. And given the scarcity of teams, you have 30 teams in the NBA, you have, sort of along the same number in the other sports leagues, plus minus, 5 here and there. There's only so many professional sports franchises to go around. It's not like they come on the market every year. So if you get a chance, that's
Sure.
something that if you have that hyper competitive entrepreneurial drive and you've achieved everything else in other areas of your life and you have the necessary cash flow, then it's something that's appealing to you.
For sure.
No matter if that's going to cost you 20, $30 million year in, year out.
So at that point, is it a matter of, we very easily evaluate, things in terms of money, but at that point, is it a matter of like valuing someone's brand? Is it a way to leverage someone's brand? For example, now Mark Cuban's name is attached to the Mavericks, and if Elon Musk were to buy a team, now Elon is involved in a pro sports team. Is it more of like a cultural investment, an influential investment in terms of like, I'm going to have a piece of a league, of a piece of the culture in terms of sports being a part of the culture, a piece of a city, in terms of like, if you're very attached to the city now? Is it more of one of those things, would you think, for like billionaires, in terms of like just increasing influence and things of that nature?
So I don't want to speak for people that I don't know personally, obviously, and I would hate to put words into people's mouths, but I do think you're on the right track there, right? I mean, buying, for the most part, these are people that have accomplished pretty much anything you could accomplish in the for-profit, business setting, the sort of like hard industrial world. Be that with technology, or be that with services, or be that with finances, or be that with real estate, whatever it might be. But I really don't think anybody goes into buying a professional sports franchise with a sort of red pen
For sure.
and like makes sure that they check the budgets and sort of loses their mind when at the end of the year they spend 5 million more than they made. If that's really your approach,
Yeah.
you're most likely in the wrong
Yeah.
business, right? So that's sort of on the back end, the mindset of the team owners.
Gotcha.
But then even then, you need a large enough number of teams for a league to exist anyway, right? So the model in the US is also built to keep non-profitable franchises afloat because you need critical mass, right? You need X number of teams to have X number of divisions and conferences and have enough games and all that stuff. If we sort of allowed teams left and right to go bankrupt just because they lost $2 million, we would run out of teams, right? So that's why we have, revenue sharing and all that stuff. To the extent that for the big four, the viability of the league at the end of the day is almost more important than the viability of the individual team.
Gotcha.
So it's the brand, it's the NFL that keeps things going. It's not really even so much the individual teams.
For sure. No, that makes total sense. And it's super interesting to see how that American model differs from the European model of promotion and relegation, and the way that despite Europe in general, and I'm no political economic expert, but just Europe in general having more, more leftward leaning or socialist leaning policies, that despite America being more capitalistic in a sense, they have a more socialistic structure of running their leagues, in terms of all the NFL teams doing revenue sharing, despite a lot of the billionaires maybe voting differently when it comes outside of the league. So can you speak on what revenue sharing is and how the American leagues differ from the European leagues maybe?
Yeah, so every league does a little bit different in terms of what needs to be shared, what individual teams can keep, right? But the fundamental idea is that the more profitable teams kick back a portion of their revenues into a pool, and then based on the percentage, everybody in the league gets a piece of that pool, right? So you have 30 teams in the league, everybody pays in, everybody gets something out of it. And obviously, if you're not putting as much in, but you're still getting a lot out, that works a little better for you. And then there are ways around it, right? So depending on the league, some things you get to keep, some things you have to pay in, right? So, some leagues, for example, everything that you sell inside of the arena during game day, right? Concession revenue, merchandise revenue, you get to keep. You do not have to kick that back to the league pool. But then obviously things like TV contracts, especially those that are handled at the league level, everybody gets, a piece of that pie. But you can also get around that if you have any sort of just uniquely team-based structured TV contracts. I think it might be the Yankees, at least for a while, they had their sort of own regional setup in terms of airing games. And to my knowledge, I do not think that was, part of what they had to kick back to the league. But again, every league does a little bit differently too. So there might be some nuances here and there. And that's a contentious issue, right? When you get to the collective bargaining agreements, when the more profitable teams, they complain about the fact that they're essentially keeping other teams afloat. And then the argument is always well, do you just want to have a league of 10 teams? Nobody's going to watch that. So collective bargaining and, revenue sharing is a sort of way to keep the entire operation just alive, right?
For sure. How important is that in terms of I know within your class you teach on the importance of having competitive balance, because without the competitive balance, there'd be no good product. No one likes to watch, one team just beat the hell out of another team, right? That competitive balance within the league is important. And we've seen it in real time within the past few years, like, when there was a lot of discontentment with the NBA during that era of Cavs Warriors every year. And then you see how engagement is up, ratings are up, et cetera, in eras of the NBA where there's a lot more parity, right? So how important, what is that concept of competitive balance, and how was that birthed? Like, I know you lectured on the NFL, 50 years ago, how important it was for like, so, entities like the Steelers or the Giants to say, we're going to come together, we're going to put the team in the sense of the league before our own individual franchises, so that there will be more competitive balance, more teams will stay afloat, and maybe individually from a team perspective, we won't make as much money in the short term, but long term, all of our valuations will go up. What kind of happened there from your perspective in terms of like that really setting in motion the American structure of how leagues are ran today with revenue sharing and things of that nature?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important to understand, especially from people outside of the industry, is what keeps sport leagues afloat is not so much the avid fan, right? What keeps sport leagues afloat is the casual watcher, right? The person that is not absolute diehard, owns every single piece of merchandise, watches every single game, and goes to every single home game that they can afford. What really keeps leagues afloat is the sort of casual so-so fans, right? And what we want to achieve is that everybody wants to have at least the belief that they can win. At the end of the day, right, you need fans to believe that their chosen team has at least a shot. Now, that can be irrational, that can be completely delusional, right? But at the very least, you want to believe that, okay, well, at least there's some semblance of a chance. So that's where competitive balance comes in. Now, of course, competitive balance is relative, right?
For sure.
So if the Mavs blow out the Suns, 40 plus points or whatever that was, right, in a game 7,
Yeah, that was
one could argue that just for that contest itself, that's not necessarily, a balanced interaction. But at the same time, it was game 7. And, clearly there was parity between the teams to even get to that particular point, right? So we want as many people to be as entertained and as much kept on the edge of their seats as possible. And we cannot do that if at tip-off, game 1 of the season, everybody pretty much has a pretty solid idea of what's going to happen 82 games later. So I say 82 games, so basketball is usually going to be my frame of reference when I talk about these things, but the same sort of mechanisms apply, right? Be that 82 games, be that 100.
Is that your main sport, basketball?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm surprised you're not more of a football fan, footy fan, being, from Germany. Are you?
No, not really. So I got into playing basketball when I was 8, and then sort of stuck with that all the way through. So
are you considered one of the rare few that your sport of choice is basketball as opposed to the traditional soccer route?
So I was born in 1985. So when I got into playing ball, it was right after Dream Team won, or like just the Dream Team, right? 1992 at the Olympics. So I got sort of swept up in just the global and especially the European euphoria when it came to basketball. So for my generation, it's actually pretty common. Now, obviously, it's nowhere near close to soccer, but it's also not as uncommon as one might think, right?
Gotcha. Very interesting. So basically, after that Dream Team Olympics, there was a generation that really started playing basketball, started hooping more than previous.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think it's increased even more so with the way, the NBA kind of broadcasts its games now and has been trying to grow the sport internationally? Do you think that if you were to go to Europe now, it's even more so, even more euphoric than when you were a kid with, these guys like the Giannis's and the Jokic's and the Lucas of the world? Do you think it's going to keep growing on that trajectory?
It's hard to say because the baseline has shifted a little bit, right? So with the dream team, it was just like, okay, like, what is happening? Like, what is this? Who are these people? What is this like sport that's happening? At this level of excitement, at that level of just excellence, right? So when you look at the participation numbers from the early '90s, it's really just this like skyrocketing phenomenon, right? And you know, then it plateaued a little bit for a while, I think, and now obviously whenever there are major European talents, I'm sure that helps. I'm sure that when Dirk was playing, I'm sure that I don't even know where he's right now. He might be in Boston. Dennis Schroeder.
Yeah, he was going to get a huge contract with LA, and then
So he's from my hometown actually.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. So I'm sure whenever you have people like that sort of become at least temporarily, the face of export basketball talent from Europe to the NBA, I'm sure there's a little bit of an interest spike. But you also always need institutional structures, right? You need clubs to sustain that. You need people to have the opportunity to play and do all these things. And most of that is still geared predominantly towards soccer, right? You need basketball academies. You need all this stuff to really get that moving forward, especially since you're lacking that school and college structure in Europe that you have in the US. Everything is club based, so it's a little different the way that functions.
Yeah, I never thought of that, right? How it's like more of the soccer model, right? Where you have these youth club teams that then they foster up into the pro teams if they make it that far, versus the USA is like very oriented to, yeah, you might have like AAU for basketball or club soccer, etc. But then the goal is to go play D1 for the NCAA, get a scholarship, and then from there, if you're good enough, go play in the pro team. So that's interesting how, despite maybe a moment of inspiration where there's an era where a player or a team really inspires a certain group of people in a certain part of the world, there still needs to be that structure behind that grassroots structure from that country in terms of being able to take advantage of that inspiration and that talent of kids and build their skill up to the point where they could make it to that level, go play college in America, or go to whatever league is dominant at the time. That's another variable that is super important that I didn't think of actually. So
yeah, and I mean every youth athlete needs a system around him or her that collectively believes in the worth of that endeavor, right? Mm-hmm. And here in the US, if you say, I'm going to play professional basketball, I'm going to play professional baseball, I'm going to play professional football, the statistics are super low that that's actually going to happen. But, if you're good enough, there's going to be a significant number of people that are going to nod their head and they're going to say, oh yeah, it's a great idea, right?
For sure.
You only get that with soccer really in Germany. Like you have to be just brutally good for somebody to say, oh yeah, basketball sounds like a great idea.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, man. I was gonna ask, so what do you think it takes for someone to go pro, right? Because in my mind, I'm like, it's a combination of talent, it's a combination of work ethic and discipline and environment that the kid grew up in, as well as like an investment into the kid in terms of like mentorship, tutelage outside the court, but also in terms of like coaching and training on the court. What all does it take, you think, for someone to actually, go pro? What are the variables?
I mean, you listed a good chunk of them, right? I mean, you can't do anything well without the requisite skill set, right? So that applies to sport as much as it applies to anything else. If you want to reach any level of excellence in any endeavor, you have to just be very, very good at it, right? Now, once you have that sort of established, you need a support system. You need to have people that believe in that particular path even being a viable option, right? And that can sort of ironically also work in different directions, right? So if you are, for example, somebody who has really, really good grades, right? You're a really, really good high school student, and you're also really, really good at playing a given sport. Now, from your parents' perspective, they're going to say, okay, well, sports sounds great, but you could also be a doctor.
For sure.
You could also be a lawyer. Maybe you could be, I don't know, a pilot, or you could be what have you. So there's these opportunity cost scenarios that look different for different types of people, right? If, on the other hand, you're really, really good at sports, and looking at your entire opportunity portfolio, what you might do in your life otherwise, and there's not a whole lot going on, in a way, it's then almost easier to double down on that, right? So you have a poor GPA, let's say, you hate school, you don't like to read, crafting some sort of scenario, right? But you are really, really good at baseball. Why wouldn't you then pursue that particular course of action with vigor and effort?
For sure.
That's the one thing that's working, right? So that's sort of one of the things too. You have to believe that sports is even a good enough path forward, and that some of the other things that you could be doing are not, right?
Yeah. So it's a matter of huge opportunity cost depending on which direction you go, and depending on who's around you to be able to say like, okay, going down that path is a worthy investment because it takes a ridiculous amount of time, effort, money, etc. And you're saying like the self-awareness is also a key component of it, right? To be able to say like, okay, maybe I'm not good at this, but I'm good at that, to go in that direction. And that's awesome. You bring up those points because, like you said, it's kind of the same thing for anything in life, right? Um, similar types of methods and philosophies, but just different, routes you could take, whether it's, with sports or a certain career interest. It's kind of similar. How would you say that's the case, just in terms of like being able to analyze which trajectory to go and how to get there?
Yeah, definitely. I think you need to have both for yourself, but then also with the people around you. You need to have that ability to sort of critically evaluate, right?
Sure.
The value and the worth of whatever it is that you're trying to get yourself into. There are plenty of parents that pull very, very talented kids out of sports,
Yeah.
just because they believe that other safer routes are available, right?
Yeah, man.
If you have the financial resources, med school sounds like a great option compared to beating the 0.02% odds of making it to the NBA.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
If you think about it, that way.
Yeah. So you recently had another kid, right?
I have one kid.
Yeah, one kid. Okay,
Okay.
congrats, man. How old are they now?
3.5.
Three and a half.
Yeah, little boy.
Awesome, man. So what from your perspective, right, as a parent of your one son, right? Like, because I had a guest on a podcast quite some time ago, but we were talking about the concept of like, depending on what socioeconomic background you're from, certain parents push their kids to pursue something that's going to bring the family more financial stability, versus some people that, they might already have that financial stability. They'll push their kid to like, you don't have to pursue something that's only oriented around money. You can pursue something else that maybe doesn't pay as much, but it'll make you happier, you're more passionate about. Where do you see yourself with your own son? I know he's only 3, but like where do you kind of see your parenting style going with him in terms of like sports or just anything?
Yeah, and then that's also an interesting point, right? Where you have to sort of take into account as well the pressures almost of your environment in terms of the things that you pursue, and that includes athletics, right? If that is your only, way forward in terms of maybe providing not only for yourself and your significant other and your kid, but also for your parents, grandparents, siblings, whatever that might be, that calculation looks way different, right? So
Yeah,
you are going to look at the main revenue generating sports in the US. I mean, you're not going to go out and say, yeah, I'm going to play volleyball.
yeah.
Can you even pay the bills playing volleyball professionally in the US? I don't even know. I
Tough,
don't
man.
think so, right? Especially if you compare that to basketball, baseball, you know, football, hockey,
Very tough.
soccer, even. So, sort of roundabout way of answering the question. I so no, like those considerations don't really go into it, right? Um, right now, he seems to enjoy soccer a whole lot. They
Right.
have a little program at daycare um, where I think it's yeah every Wednesday, soccer coach comes in and they kick the ball around and they do some exercises and do their thing, and he really seems to like it. So that's
And he's only
good.
3.5, and you can already tell he enjoys it, and he's pretty decent at it.
Yeah, he comes home and he shows us what he learned. So like we have a little soccer net in the backyard, and he like comes home and he's like, hey, let me show you what we did at soccer today. So it's fun, but
That's
he's
awesome. So
he's,
he
he's
does have some German in him, huh? He does have the
yeah,
German blood in him, huh?
I guess. I guess so.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome, man. That's awesome. I have a younger sister. She's 4 years old. I have two younger sisters, right? So one of them, she's about to graduate high school, and since she was about 3 years old, always had a huge interest in soccer and basketball and just playing, which is kind of weird for a girl at her age at the time. She was kind of a tomboy with me and my younger brother, but my youngest sister, she's 4, and she's like total opposite. So when you tell me that your son's 3.5 and he comes home and he wants to play soccer, I'm like, dang, I wanted my sister, my youngest one, to come out and now that she's 4, be ready to play soccer, but she's super girly and is not into the soccer, the basketball, any of that. She's more like ballet, that type of stuff. But that's awesome to hear, man. Maybe you got another athlete in the family, man.
who knows? But if not, then not. The only thing
Yeah.
that we're kind of looking at is, okay, well, he needs to do something to move his body, right? So it's a sort of very old school, healthy body, healthy mind, healthy spirit type of approach, the way that we look at that. Um,
I'm a big believer in that. Yeah.
but he needs to do something. He needs to, and that's the same thing that my parents did when I was playing sports. If basketball hadn't stuck, I believe field hockey was going to be the next thing that my parents were going to take me to. Um,
Yeah, man. No, I
played
think
field hockey. I played field hockey once in high school for like 2 weeks. Did not like it, so I'm glad basketball stuck, I suppose.
there you
But
go. You're a true hooper, true hooper. No, I think it's important, man, to just do something, to do different things in life, outside of work and school, for example, just because you learn so many valuable lessons outside of it. There's lessons that I've learned playing basketball that I didn't learn playing soccer, that I didn't learn, podcasting, it's just like kind of you learn through these different things in life that you can then carry those lessons on into other areas of life. So I think to your point, it's important, for people to just do things, whether you're a young kid, playing a sport, or you're an older person already working, full time, 9 to 5, just doing some kind of hobby outside of work. So I think that's important, man. But I want to shift gears a little bit. So I know we talked a little bit about, the pro sports space and how a lot of times you have to define your goal in terms of, am I wanting to turn a profit off of this investment, or do I just want to own a team as I've now accomplished everything else I wanted to in my life? I want to turn gears into the college sports space, right? Since there's a lot going on with, new NIL rules coming out, big deals being signed for, quarterbacks like Quinn Ewers at RUT, or Bijan Robinson with Lamborghini, right? And Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban are taking huge shots at each other, from the A&M and Alabama perspective, in terms of Saban saying like, A&M bought all their players, and Jimbo's like, no, we didn't. So what is going on in the NIL space, man? What does this mean for the finances of college football and college football in general, man.
So to that last point, indirectly speaking, every major athletics program in the country buys their athletes.
Mhm.
They do that because they're able to spend more money on facility, more money on training, staff, more money on coaches, more money on nutritional support. So it's not like your brand or your reputation or your expertise or the quality of your strength and conditioning staff or the quality of your training facility just grows on trees. All those things cost money, right? So everybody to a certain extent uses their financial resources in a particular way. And so that's kind of like, well, some programs are, buying their players at that level. Everybody sort of kind of is, right? Because you just have financial resources that you can spend on certain things that somebody else can't.
So to kind of butt in real quick, so you're saying that essentially all college athletics players are bought. It's just a matter of whether or not the money is actually being put in their pocket, as opposed to the money being put towards a fancy, grandiose stadium, or the locker rooms or the training staff, the different package that's given to them, aside from money being put in their pocket. Is that kind of the?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the YouTube, behind the scene videos of, Clemson revealing their brand new training
Yeah,
facilities, and it's, indoor wave pools and 10 massage rooms, all this stuff. That's not free.
for sure.
It's just a matter of sort of apportioning your resources in a particular way. So you might not give it to the players and you might invest it into the quality of their athletic upbringing or the quality of their education, but you are still using money
I see.
to make a case for your program being a better fit for that athlete compared to another program.
I see. So it's a matter of where the money is being put. So what's gonna happen, man? Like, what's gonna happen with all this NIL stuff? Like, is it better for college football? Is it worse? Is it better for athletes? Like, I know the answer is more complicated and nuanced than that, but I'm just curious your perspective on how it's going to shake up the landscape.
So I think there are a couple of layers to this, right? So I think from almost a non-sport perspective, but just from a baseline finance viewpoint, I think it's always a good idea that your employees have a sense of being compensated to some extent fairly for their efforts. Right, so anybody that brings some sort of value to the table, and somebody right now is thinking, well, student athletes aren't employees, but anybody who's creating some sort of value for somebody else needs to go home at the end of the day thinking to themselves, I'm getting something out of this that is adequately proportionate to what I'm putting in, right? Now, with the NIL rules, I suspect that this is almost going to create this sort of like two-class society, right? So you're going to have people that are already in major programs, because why would somebody pay you for your name or your likeness? Because they want to benefit from eyeballs being on your name and your likeness, right? So who has the eyeballs? It's the athletes who are already in high profile, high reputation, high brand programs, right? So those players will almost double down on that, right? So if you play for Clemson, if you play for Alabama, for A&M, for Texas, you get a lot of airtime. You're on TV a lot. Those are the players that will be able to benefit from those NIL rules. And then I think on the bottom end, you might get, players that nobody's ever heard of. They're going to start cashing checks for like $250 from the local like used car dealer.
Gotcha.
So I think that's really the way that this is going to go, where it's going to make the rich richer because they are in a system that exposes them in a way to the world that makes giving them money for their name and likeness even worth it. And then on the flip side, you have people that are so local that, it's like, okay, $200, $300.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's something I didn't think of, right? Like for these hyper local universities where maybe within that small geographic area, they're a big deal. Maybe the local barbecue or the local car dealership or whatever will be like, here's a small amount of money, to endorse us, and maybe we'll get a little uptick in business. That's interesting, man. So do you think it's going to create a bigger disparity in college football in terms of the big brands like being able to dominate even more now that they're able to pool talent even more so to their universities?
It adds another bargaining chip, right? So again, if you are a Lamborghini, or if you are a Nike, or if you are in Adidas, you want people to see your property, right? You want people to see your assets. If you're not on TV, why am I paying you any money?
Yeah.
So those are going to be the players and the programs by extension that will benefit from this, right? So it's just going to add another bargaining chip, right? So if you have a recruit come in, or you're on a recruiting trip, and now with the NIL rules, you can say, well, you're going to be on ESPN every other week. People will see the name on the back of your jersey every 14 days, right? And you can take that and you can run that by your representative, and that person can take that to Under Armour, right? And they can say, well, as long as I'm going to stay healthy, as long as I'm going to do my thing, I can guarantee you exposure. 3 hours every other Saturday on ESPN.
Yeah, the ecosystem is very interesting in terms of how it's evolved from a few years ago to now, where it's like, these players have built followings on social media for a number of years, ever since they were getting recruited in high school. And now at the collegiate level, they're attached to a big name program, not only leveraging their social media accounts, but also leveraging the, you know, broadcasting tools locally at the university, like a Longhorn Network doing, local interviews with, Quinn Ewers or Bijan. And then you've got stuff going on with, the bigger sports media entities like, ESPN, for example. And it's just so much exposure in so many different places that these brands can show up in attachment to these players, that it's just interesting to see where the money flows and interesting to see how it evolves. I wanted to ask Dr. H, because I was super curious about these perspectives, while I took your class. So there was the concept of the athletic department and the role they serve for a university in terms of it really not being a tool for the university to make money, that contrary to popular belief, this is one of the biggest things I took away from class essentially. Like, contrary to popular belief, sports teams really don't make as much money as we think, and especially collegiate programs usually don't make money, and it's more of a marketing tool for the school. What is an athletic department's real role for a university, man?
Yeah, so that's really one of the major disconnects I think that a lot of people have when they think about college athletics. And what also makes it difficult is that a lot of the people that speak on college athletics, they speak on it very much from the perspective of this is sort of the holy grail that we need to protect, right? It's amateurism, it's young men and women playing a sport, and we need to somehow uphold the sanctity of this institution. If you were to look solely at sports, at the athletics department from an operational perspective, right? There's about a dozen, 15, 20 that make money, right? That at the end of the season, they have generated more revenue than what they have cost the university. So this is why every single year at some point, somebody's going to write an op-ed, somebody's going to write some sort of opinion piece somewhere complaining about the cost of college athletics, right? So why do we have football teams and why are we not, I don't know, building computer labs? Because a university has decided that a football team is a better way to spend their money in terms of recruiting students. That's why, right? So if you look at especially the non-financial ways in which athletics contributes to universities' well-being, really, right? You get recruitment benefits from having, you don't even need to have winning teams. You just need to have something, right?
Sure. People want to party, young freshmen, sophomores, they want to go to tailgates, they want to have a good time.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
And especially for out-of-state students that know nothing else about the university, that all they look at is that sort of minimum baseline information that they can get from Google. The first thing that they're going to look at is their football or basketball team. That's just the way it's going to work, right? So you get higher application numbers. You get higher donations, right? If you have, sports teams. After winning seasons or after bowl wins, you get an uptick in applications. There are scholars that have found that if you have more successful athletic teams on campus, even the quality of your applicants is higher, which intuitively makes sense, right? So if you graduate high school with, a 4.0 GPA and you have all these extracurricular activities and you essentially get to choose where you go to college. After a certain sort of baseline, you can get a really good education at a lot of places. And then what are you going to choose? Like, what factors are you going to consider to choose based on? Well, what else are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to sport events, right? So then you're going to apply to the place that has, the good football team or the good basketball team, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of these sort of like non-financial ways, right? So you're in the media more, right? More headlines, more airtime, more screen time. People will talk about you more if you have, a high reputation athletics department that produces teams that compete relatively well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits that don't show up necessarily on the income statement, on the balance sheet. There's like subconscious, psychological, marketing implications of having good athletics teams, or even just teams that compete, on national television, or just in general in the SEC or the Big 12, et cetera. There's a lot of value there for the university, is what you're saying, as opposed to, people who say like, oh, why don't we invest instead of the football team into the labs or into these studies? You're saying that in aggregate, it's a huge benefit to the university to invest resources there.
And none of those things will show up as revenue on the athletic department's income statement, right? Mm-hmm. All of that benefit will go to the university. So the way that one really needs to look at an athletics department, it's just another way for a school to spend money with the goal to A, increase enrollment, and B, enhance the quality of student life for those already enrolled. Nobody goes out and says, oh yeah, we're going to go have a football team. That's a wonderful idea for us to make some extra money. Because A, it's not, right, for most schools. And B, that's also really not what it's about, right? So you can spend your money on sports, or you can spend it on, I don't know, like high school counselor dinners. Mm-hmm. That connects high schools with the university, or you can spend that money on advertising and marketing, or you can do all kinds of different stuff with it. At the end of the day, you need to ask yourself, are we doing the most efficient thing possible with our financial resources with the goal of enrolling as many students as possible given our capacity?
It's so interesting. I love the way you articulate it in the sense that the goal here is increase enrollment and enhance the quality of student life across campus, right? And all those two things bring so many benefits to the university. So it's a matter of like, you have this amount of money that you could spend with those goals in mind. And it's just really hard to efficiently achieve that same result, that same ROI on your marketing and advertising spend as it is to just invest in the football team and have, a kick-ass football team.
Yeah. And even if the football team is not kick ass, just if you think about this from a leadership perspective, what's a better proposal? Let's just dump $10 million into this advertising campaign that we're never, ever going to see again. Or we can invest in our sports on campus.
Yeah. And when you put it that way, it's the answer becomes very clear.
Right. So of course, that money is gone, and that athletics department, as a revenue center considered by itself, might lose money because they've spent more than they made. But in turn, that difference is going to come out of the university's pocket, and the university decided to spend that money in the first place, right?
Interesting. Yeah, no, I appreciate the perspective, man, because one of the goals I had in bringing you on this podcast, on this platform, is I wanted to shed light on how, pro and collegiate sports, whether in the States or abroad, is so much more nuanced and so much more complex and complicated than people like to make it seem when they throw these blanket statements on it, like, oh, well, sports teams make all this money, or college athletic departments make all this money, why can't they pay players? Well, the answer is so much more nuanced and complex. So I appreciate you shedding light on how it's not just black and white answers. It's more the answers within the space or within so much more of a gray area. What do you think of, like, when people have been saying for years, like, we should be paying collegiate athletes, right? Because there's so many arguments across all ends of the spectrum, right? Like, some people say, some people on the NCAA side of things, the collegiate athletic side of things, say like, oh, well, we don't make money anyways. But like, it depends how you do your accounting, how it's going to show up. Right. And then also it's like, it depends on what university you are. But what do you think of like that argument of like, we should pay college athletes? Like, obviously people want to make it seem like the answer is very black and white, yes or no. But, what do you think of it? How complex is it?
One of the major challenges for that debate is that, to some extent, people have that debate on different playing fields. There are philosophical arguments, and then there are financial and economic arguments. And it's almost like apples and oranges to some extent when one side makes a case for or against using one particular class of arguments, and the other side is trying to counter that with a different class of arguments. So no financial or economic case that I could make in the world is going to convince somebody who on an ideological level believes a student athlete is an amateur who shouldn't get paid. For that person, the debate is over before it even started. Nothing I can say about the financial contexts and about whether or not schools can afford it is going to sway that person's perspective. If they beforehand, before we even start talking about it, have decided that a student athlete is a particular type of person who should not be given a salary for their work, right? So I think that's really one of the challenges, where you have to solve two questions at the same time. And the arguments from one are not conducive to solving it from the perspective of the other.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible perspective, man, because you just shed light on something that I've noticed, but I haven't really been able to articulate what I was witnessing in terms of like some people arguing from a financial perspective versus others arguing from a philosophical perspective, right? And it's like apples to oranges, and it's like you're not even on the same playing field to begin with. And it's just so complex because there are so many different implications, right? In terms of the philosophical side of like, yes, these guys have dedicated their lives to said sport and essentially are not able to gain as much value from what they're studying in the classroom because they're having to put so much time forth to succeed on the field. So it's like their education is suffering. So yeah, they say like, oh, I gave you a full ride, free education, but it's like you're not being able to maximize the education, or it's very difficult to maximize the education because you have to put so much time on the field. Um, so from certain perspectives, philosophically, right, it's like, yes, these guys deserve to be paid as opposed to, struggling, not even being able to have meals sometimes, because, they're, or, whatever the case may be, right, depending on what socioeconomic background they came from to begin with, versus like the financial implications and arguments of like, oh, well, what would these guys do? They're amateurs. What would they even do at age 18 with, X amount, thousands of dollars in their pockets? So I think it's incredible perspective, incredible take by you in terms of like just the philosophical versus financial. What do you think? Do you think that a lot of people who are against, paying student athletes, do you think there's some unfair arguments that are made in terms of like these guys are amateurs and they wouldn't know what to do with it or things like that?
So for one, I think that particular type of stance to take is bordering sort of on the patronizing.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
Like if that's really your sole concern, well then why don't we just pay them and educate them on what to do with the money?
Yeah, yeah.
Like that can't be an argument in itself, to just wholesale decide that we can't pay anybody for their effort, right? Um, the way that I always kind of look at it, and this is the most high profile example just from the news. I have no personal problem with Ben Simmons, but Ben Simmons wasn't getting paid and he still didn't go to class.
Mhm.
So just by virtue of giving athletes money is not going to make them more or less likely to pursue their academic obligations beyond just staying eligible to compete.
For sure.
That just, to me, just that's a fallacy. That just doesn't make sense. You either care deeply enough about your educational attainment from like a personal identity standpoint, that it means something to you to go to class and to be a good student and to make the best of your education. And then getting a paycheck is not going to change that. Or you don't. And then getting a paycheck is also not going to change that. Right. So that's sort of where I stand on that. The other thing is, the moment you have $8 million to give to Coach K, you have $7 million to give to Coach K and $1 million to give to your athletes.
Yeah. Huge point.
So that's sort of the other side of it, right? The moment you decided to have an athletics program in the first place, you made the conscious, deliberate decision that you had tens, if not hundreds, for some programs, millions of dollars that you believed could be well spent on sports. Once you've made that decision, it's just a matter of priorities. Do you believe that that should all go to facilities? Do you believe that should all go to the coach? Do you think that should be best spent on your strength and conditioning staff? Would that be better spent on, counseling and mental training and development? Or should it in fact go directly to the players? That's a decision 6 steps down the line, but you've already decided you have money. Yeah. You just decided not to give it to your players.
Yeah. Mic drop right there. So it's just you decided you had the money. Now it's a matter of priorities, facilities, coaching, students, etc. It's just a matter of where the money's moving. Yeah, that's interesting, man. It's so interesting too to think of. It's funny you bring up Ben Simmons, given all the talk he's been in lately. And it's funny. I was actually reading something the other day where they brought up his how his recent patterns of like what happened with Brooklyn, how he didn't end up playing the playoff series, or what happened, how it ended with Philly, and they traced it back to his behaviors with LSU. But it's just funny, how he keeps coming up on throughout the media and even this little small podcast platform we're talking about him. But anyways, yeah, no, it's interesting. I think like whether you're paying them or not, if they have a actual feasible chance to make it pro, they're probably not investing. Unless it means a lot to them or their parents are probably not investing as much time as they could be, or maybe they don't want to invest any time at all. They're not investing it into the classroom, right? So I don't think paying them is going to make a difference either. um, but it's just interesting, man. So there you guys have it, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very complex equation when it comes to the collegiate athlete finances, man.
And I will also say that on the other hand, to those that are, fervently in favor of paying student athletes, handing somebody $1,000 long term, that's not going to make up for the fact that they might not graduate with their degree or with a 2.4 GPA with a major that nobody's going to hire them with.
Yeah.
Right. So even within that consideration of, okay, well, we have these young athletes, they give up a lot of their time that they could be spent studying. We have to somehow compensate them for that sacrifice. Let's not forget that the obtainment of an undergraduate degree in the US is by far the single most important milestone to achieve if you want long-term financial security. Unless, of course, you make it in athletics, then, but if you sign a multi-million-dollar contract, then what did it matter if you got 10K a season in college?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the other take on it, right? It's, to me, all of this is, even from the NCAA's perspective, it's a distraction. You cannot outpay the fact that a lot of students do not get the best out of their opportunity to go to college. So if you have a 60-hour work week, right? If you're on the football team in season, that's pretty reasonable, right? If you really think about it. If you have a 50-hour work week, 60-hour work week, and you literally cannot stay awake long enough to get your classwork done, to study appropriately, to get the grades you need to graduate with the GPA that you want or need, then it's not going to matter if you got 5K, 10K, or 20K a season, unless you actually end up playing pro ball. But then it also won't matter. Yeah. So the question is, are you making the best out of your opportunity of being on a college campus? Yeah. Everything else is just noise, right?
Everything else is just noise. Ooh, yeah, no, it's like it's so weird because it's like either way, did it matter, right? If you're going to sign that huge multi-million-dollar deal at the pro level, or if it goes the other direction too. Yeah, man, it's a complicated thing. Do you think we could ever reach a world where it's like, people playing for collegiate athletic programs weren't even full-time students or students at all? I know it sounds wild to even say, but it's like these guys, and I've spoken with, multiple friends of mine that are or were student athletes, that I won't say, names or what programs, but it's like, these guys have been told, the moment you step foot on campus and start playing for the program, like, you're not here to study. You're not. You're here to play football for this program and give it your all and aid us in, getting to the CFP or winning a national title, and it's like, it's just wild to like you said, it's a distraction, and it's wild. It's a wild attempt to mask the fact that these guys are not getting the most out of their opportunity to get an education on campus, because it's like they're having to invest so much time into their efforts on the field, and then it gets to a point where they're not even able to get proper sleep, hence properly recover, hence be in the best shape to perform on the field, which is their main objective anyway. So it's like the school stuff just takes away from the main goal the university has them there for, which is to play football, which is to win, which is to market the school in an appropriate way. So what are your thoughts on that, man? Like, could this space evolve even more to the point where it's like guys aren't even really studying anymore at all? They're just there to play and they're getting paid for it.
I mean, that notion is at least as old as when I was a master's student myself. 2011, 2012, 2013. We were throwing that around in class, right? It's like, why do they have to be students? Yeah. Especially if you consider, some of the things that we talked about previously in terms of why do we even do things. There is a way you could look at athletics just as on-campus performance art, right? Yeah. So you hire, or you bring a band to campus. You have movie screenings on campus. You have art performances on campus, all in the pursuit of making things more fun for your students. I mean, you could just say, well, okay, we're just going to have players. We're just going to have sports teams, with people that we just play.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, right? Because I'm curious, right? Does that save the university money, and does it save a seat for someone else that can be in that classroom or get into the university, in terms of, like, say, one of the UT football players now in the future, instead of them being a student athlete, now they're solely an athlete for the collegiate program. That saves, in my head, right? It's telling me like that saves one extra seat in the classroom. That saves thousands of dollars in tuition that were given to X student for a full ride. Now maybe they can just pay them. Is that another way that money can be moved around to maybe save the university money, have the players happy, more healthier, and then also making students have more opportunity as well? Like, is there a way to kind of move things around? Was that some of the stuff y'all talked about?
Yeah, the challenge, of course, is that at the end of the day, every student that you bring on campus, unless you truly give them a full ride, and most athletic scholarships are not full rides, right? Unless you truly pay for every single cent, then every additional student, assuming you are under capacity, is actually beneficial for the university, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also something that we have to take into account, that from a university perspective, paying somebody half their tuition is still better than them not being there at all.
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic. I remember I loved learning about that in your class, actually, in terms of like the financial value of each student, being on campus, whether, even if they're only paying a certain percentage of their tuition, right? So it's just super interesting to see. And I remember that case study we did. It's been so many months now, but it was like something along the lines of like this hypothetical scenario where an athletic program, like, they were like, what? All these, no, it was actually a real scenario, right? Where it was like a D2 school. What was it? They, instead of like cutting back their scholarships, as most universities did in the pandemic, they actually turned them up some more. And they're like, we're going to give a bunch of these athletes that otherwise wouldn't get a scholarship, maybe we'll give them like a partial scholarship. And just because they got a scholarship, now there's an extra seat, being filled in the classroom. Now people are paying more tuition, right? Was that the scenario?
Yeah, that was that final reflection paper for the class, right? Where the idea is that as long as we have so every open seat in any classroom on any campus around the nation is wasted revenue, right? So if you have the capacity in terms of room and board and teaching faculty, every student that you do not teach is lost revenue. Right, so let's assume on average, a student is worth $25,000 to the university. So you can choose for that to be a normal, quote unquote, non-student athlete student. It's a full paying student, but that student first has to apply. They have to be admitted and they have to actually show up, right? Then you get the $25,000 every year that they're worth. Or what you could do is you could give a 50% scholarships to a student athlete and for sure get 12,500. So every open seat is a waste of money. So as long as you have open seats, it doesn't matter if at the end of the day, you're going to get full price for it or just 50% or 25% of it. Anything is going to be better than having an empty bed and an open seat in the classroom.
Wow. Yeah. So anything's better than an empty bed and an open seat in the classroom. So you might as well, if you are able to, you might as well at least collect some amount of value as opposed to the entirely lost value in an open seat. It's interesting.
And let's not forget, you might have room and board paid for you. You might have other, amenities paid for you. You might have tuition paid for you. But you're still going to go out to eat. You're still going to spend money on campus. You're still going to participate, in the social life. You're still going to do things that, both from a non-financial and financial way, are going to benefit the university. So, unless you are literally paying for every single thing, every single dollar, any additional student on your campus is good for your bottom line, for your university.
100%. That makes sense.
It doesn't matter if they're an athlete or how they got there.
Just that they're there. Yeah, that makes sense for the university itself and also like the surrounding area, right? In terms of like, depending on the city they're in, just economic value for the city in general. This was awesome, Dr. H. I appreciate your insight on that stuff. I know you're a busy man, so I want to move towards wrapping it up, but I'm curious, what were your studies on unemployment and happiness and all that good stuff when you were getting your master's in HR management, man?
So one of the things that I've always been really intrigued in is to sort of, I love human nature, right? I like all the crazy things that we as human beings do, and I like all the psychology stuff. And I'm especially intrigued by it when it comes with hard data and sort of like people putting their money where their mouth is with their actions and not just with their words, right? So when I wrote my master's thesis, it was on personnel economics, which is sort of the quantification of human behavior in the workplace, right? And my thesis was on unemployment, and it was on how unemployment makes people feel. Now, mind you, this is over 10 years ago now, so there might have been some cultural shifts. But essentially what I did was we looked at a data set. It was all survey based. It was all European countries at the time. It's like 20, 30,000 respondents. This like insane survey they do every year, I think. And what I looked at was sort of how men and women are different in their experience of unemployment. And everybody hates losing their job, right? No surprise, right? Men mostly care about losing their own job because that also means loss of status. It's an identity challenge. You sort of lose some of that that sort of breadwinner in the family type of perspective for yourself. Women care when they lose their job, obviously, right? So there's economic ramifications to consider. If you lose, 50% of household income, it's a problem. But then women also cared greatly when their partners lost their jobs. Whereas men didn't care. It's like, wife loses her job. Yeah, okay, well, So, and by didn't care, what we looked at were measures of well-being, right? So self-reported measures of how happy people are in their lives, right? That's what we used as an indicator for how much they cared in response to losing their job or in response to unemployment. So that was my master's thesis, right? So everybody cares about losing their own job. Men only care about losing their own job, and the women in that data set, and it was European countries only.
Okay.
They were affected both ways, and you can conjecture why that might be the case, right? Which is the downside if you only use survey data like that. You don't get a chance to talk to anybody. So
I'd be curious to see if there were any, differences within the results from the surveys and just y'all's overall research. If in America or South America versus Europe specifically, just based on the different cultural implications. But that seems to make sense, right, from a common sense perspective, in the sense that, like, throughout the course of time, men have always been seen as like this, the responsibility bearing person in the family, in terms of like whether it was like ancient tribal times going out and hunting, the buffalo or whatever the case may be, versus, within, this is obviously changing, in recent years, but within, the past couple hundred years, in terms of being that guy to bring the bread home to the family and provide for the family. So it seems that there'd naturally be psychologically a way more adverse effect on the male losing their job than the female, right? In terms of like maybe men being a little bit more status oriented or prideful, and also a little bit more anxious to kind of not be able to fulfill those obligations as a father, as a husband, right, in terms of bringing home the bread. So that's super interesting, man. I'm curious also, what I know you're big into performance psychology, right? And how to enhance performance.
Yeah, recently, especially trying to read a lot. I go sort of through these shifts of like content areas that I'm really into, and then I go on these Amazon shopping sprees, and a week later 10 books show up. So how it goes.
I wish I could show you my bookshelf. I have a similar thing going on where I get very excited about a topic. I hear a podcast or I see something, I'm like, man, I'd love to learn about that. And got a bunch of books over here. I stopped buying them. I made a rule, like, no more books, because I need to actually read them. But I got a similar thing going on over here.
Yeah, books are a great tool. For a while, I tried to get into kind of like the podcast thing, and I think everybody sort of differs in the way that they prefer to consume content and information. And I say that intentionally, right? So students always kind of say that they have like a way that they learn better. When objectively speaking, there are actually ways that are better than others in terms of information uptake, regardless of our preferences. Now, the thing, of course, is if we don't do the things at all that are better because we don't like them, then of course we're not going to learn anything, right? So I've just always loved the medium of the book, especially the physical book itself. So that's why reading for me has always been the preferred mode to learn.
Yeah. Would you say objectively that reading is better than just listening or things of that nature? Would you say that objectively you're able to retain the information and process it better than other mediums?
So the one thing that reading does for you is that it's a very active form of information intake, right? And I mean active in like a very literal physiological sense. Again, this is sort of like from parenthood. I recently read a book on the values of early reading and the values of an early love for books. And one of the things that they talked about is that from just like a sheer physiological response profile, children stay more active reading compared to passively, for example, watching TV. So there's like higher heart rate, they move around a little bit more, they shift their bodies more when they read compared to just sort of being like a vegetable in front of a screen, right?
Yeah.
So the one thing that reading does is it makes you a bit more of a participant in what it is that you're actually consuming. So you can listen to a podcast, for example, and it's really easy to tune it out. And it's easy to miss something and not to care missing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
So there's like this flow of information and you're listening to it. The challenge, of course, also is that with the ease of consumption comes the temptation to listen to podcasts while doing something else, which then sort of magnifies the problem, right? So you might cook, or you might exercise, or you might drive the car, or you might do X, Y, Z, right?
All the things I do while listening to podcasts.
There you go, right? So the ease and the convenience of it, which is the strength of it, which is why it's so awesome, because it brings so much content to people that would be too busy otherwise. It's also a danger in terms of that it doesn't allow us to be quite as active in terms of engaging with the content that it is that we're actually consuming, right? So, when I read, I might read the same paragraph like twice. When I read, I really read, there's a voice inside my head where I'm reading to myself.
Exactly.
Right? Takes like 10 times as long, obviously. But it is a much more challenging way for the brain to engage with that information, right? So you always have to weigh your options. And it's the same thing with everything, right? Like, what are your opportunity costs? I have all the time in the world. I can sit down and read like for hours, right? Not everybody can do that.
Yeah.
If I was in a position where I couldn't do that, then maybe I wouldn't read quite as much. And then maybe I wouldn't, put that premium on printed word as my sort of preferred information medium.
Absolutely.
But because I can do it, I continue to do it, right?
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense, right? In the sense of like some people like yourself, like myself, they want access to that information. They want to learn and process that information. However, the problem they might have, as I have sometimes too, is like you maybe don't have enough time to be able to sit down and read, and you could take in that amount of information a lot easier, a lot faster, while simultaneously driving, for example, if you just listen to a podcast or a video. However, I think it's interesting that you bring up, the physiological implications, like actually physically holding the book, your eyes following the words, the voice in the back of your head reading it to you inside your own head. And I'm curious if that allows you to engage with information better and learn it better and retain it better. Because me, I love podcasts, and I love certain podcasts in the sense that like I can see a conversation unfolding and feel the presence of each person conversing with one another, and then my presence and trying to listen to it. But it's easy to miss a part of it, to switch lanes and you miss it, or I'm cooking and I'm doing something and I miss it, right? Versus as a book, I feel like the information might come a little bit slowly, but a little more slowly, right? But it's like retained a lot better because I'm underlining, I'm annotating. Is it better reading wise, do you think, to annotate and all that? Do you think reading just in general offers that more of like deeper retention of the information?
I guess it depends, right? It depends on why you're reading and what your true sort of purpose for it is, right? So if you're reading in terms of studying, if we're bringing this back to sort of the school level where you want to be able to regurgitate information or use it again in a different context, then yeah, I mean that's sort of like that century old approach of annotating, making notes in the margins, making notes on the side, highlighting concepts that you don't quite get, look them up again, all this good stuff. That might not be always the reason why one reads, right? So everybody has their sort of particular reason why they read something or what they want to do with that information. The way I read, I find myself frequently just, usually it's at the end of a chapter or a section, just closing the book and thinking about what I read. Which of course kind of like doubles and triples down on the time it reads and time it takes to read the book. But just for me to engage with the material and kind of like think about, what that means for me and, for things that I've previously believed. Like I'm right now, I just started a book on, so like the history and origins of the polarized socio-political climate in the US and how that can be sort of traced back to the 18th century founding fathers years. It's called American Schism.
American Schism.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to check that out, man. That's interesting, especially in these very increasingly polarized times that we're in, where it's like you have to pick a side, which for someone like myself is extremely hard to do. And I don't really conform to the idea of like left or right, conservative, liberal. I just feel like humans are so much deeper than that, than just having to conform to one side of the aisle or the other. And I feel like it's great to be able to, side with one side on said topic, but side with the other side on another topic and be more nuanced in your response as opposed to just picking a side and sticking to it. But that's an aside. But yeah, I have to check that out, man. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, the notion that a human being could possibly agree with every single checkbox that
Yeah,
quote unquote belongs to either the left or the right, it just intuitively to me is so asinine. Like, how could that possibly be true?
yeah. It's
But
a wild
that's
notion.
kind of how it works. But yeah, so reading, that's kind of like
Yeah.
the preferred mode for me.
Preferred mode. No, that's awesome, man. I'm trying to become a better reader. I was prior to college, I was kind of a little little rascal growing up. I was trying to always get out of any type of studying that I could. So I would every year at the end of the year, the teachers would at the elementary school I was at, they would ask, a couple kids to go take out the trash. And I realized one year in the trash would be the teacher's edition of the book. And I would take one for myself so that the next year I wouldn't have to read or do. So I went a huge portion of my life without reading. And I barely picked it back up, in college. And I suffered a lot. I wonder sometimes if I would have turned out a lot smarter had I read from a young age as I was supposed to. But I try to read now. I'm trying to get faster at it and be able to retain the information better. But I like to do what you said, in terms of like maybe I'm not reading the book as fast, but I like to close it after a few pages or a chapter and just think about it, reflect on it. And I feel like, at least for me, I feel like that's better than just taking in a huge influx of information and forgetting about it or maybe not utilizing it later on. I like to actually, take it in, think about it, and see what I could use. So.
Right. Yeah, that is the key. And you start the question with performance psychology. Um, that's the key, right? So to switch that focus from consumption to action, right? So not just learning about things, not just putting things into your brain, but also figuring out ways to actually put that to life, right? And that can involve things like new perspective on things that you hadn't previously considered, right? So you might learn something new about, I don't know, gun rights, or you might learn something new about immigration or about healthcare or whatever it might be, right? And that doesn't just have to be a sort of like passive
Yeah.
massing of just information or facts, but you can very actively engage with that and kind of ask yourself, okay, well, what does it do to my preconceived notions on these topics? Like, how is this going to alter the way that I think about, these
Yeah.
different types of things?
Absolutely. It takes energy. Sometimes it can be hard to do, especially if old notions or philosophies within yourself are challenged and you have to think about it and kind of fight the conflicting ideas. But consumption to action, I love that, man. It kind of reminds me of another quote that I really love, which is not that knowledge is power, but applied knowledge is power. So that's beautiful, man. To kind of wrap it up, Dr. H, since we're going on 2 hours now, but yeah, what would you say are the biggest things that everyday people can do to perform better? What are some of the biggest things you've learned that help you?
So not to get like too deep into the weeds of
Uh-huh.
philosophy here, but I think
Which
first
I
of
can
all,
definitely do. Which I can definitely do. So don't take me there. But yeah.
I think first of all, we need to have a good grasp for ourselves what it is that we actually want to become better at. So right now, especially, I see so many people, and that can be friends, that can be family members, that can be students. Everybody wants to optimize. Everybody wants to become better. Everybody wants to, get into self-development and have better habits and X, Y, Z, without first sort of digging deep enough to truly understand why they want to do the things in the first place and whether or not those really are the areas in life that are worth optimizing after all. And this isn't something that I made up or I came up with, but I mean that's a sort of standard thought in some of the like personal development classics, right? I mean everybody can run up a ladder real fast, like Stephen Covey, right? 7 Habits of Highly Influential People, like he talks about this. You can climb a ladder really fast. If you put that ladder against a building or a wall that you actually don't need to climb up, why does it matter how fast you're climbing up that ladder, right? Like, why are you optimizing things that you actually don't care about? Why are you becoming the best at stuff that you really don't want to do?
Yeah. Ooh, those are some bars right down right there, man. That's some powerful wisdom. If you put a ladder against a building or wall that you don't even want to go up, then what's the point? Yeah, I feel like it goes back to self-awareness, and that's it's funny you bring that up. That's something I was thinking about when I was working in B2B sales with AT&T. I was like, why would I go up this ladder? Like, yeah, I had to do it for the present moment for financial reasons, but I quickly realized, it was time to pivot just because it wasn't a ladder I wanted to climb. It wasn't a building I wanted to go up. So defining why we want to optimize, defining what we want to actually get better at is important.
Yeah,
Awesome, man.
that's really where it starts at. And that can obviously change, and you bring up financial reasons. That's also one of those things that I feel like gets unduly scoffed at,
Mm.
right? You need to pay the bills, and don't let anybody tell you different. Like, if you cannot pay the bills, life is miserable,
Yeah.
right? Like, ask anybody who's done any sort of empirical work into human well-being, human flourishing, human happiness. If you don't know whether or not you're going to keep the lights on next week, your purposeful work or your passion driven hobby is not going to cut it. So you need to pay the bills. Once that is sort of squared away, obviously one can ask the question, okay, well, are your bills too high? Are you living above your means? And that's a different conversation, right? But especially early on in life, financial motive, I think, is perfectly fine, right? Like, bills need to be paid, student debt needs to be paid off, other things need to be handled. So, I think that's perfectly fine in a lot of
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. This is no, this is awesome, man. I feel like I'm interviewing Naval Ravikant right now. He's I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but like the almanac of Naval Ravikant. He went on the Joe Rogan and a couple other platforms, and he kind of spoke on similar things. And one of the things he said is like a great way to make people the happiest version of themselves is get them in an environment where they're doing something they're passionate about. But what you'd have to do first is get everybody rich, because you have to handle the bills
Yeah.
first. That comes first before being able to tap into your passionate side. Eliminating the fear of how will I just live and live stably.
Yeah.
So it's a great point.
And I don't know if it's Warren Buffett. I think it's Buffett who said it. It's something along the lines of, and of course, this might be one of those fake Instagram quotes, right? Nobody knows. Um,
Plenty of
it's,
those.
it's something along the lines of, I'll give my kids enough that they can do anything, but not enough that they can do everything. Right? So it's the same sort of principle. Like, of course, he's not going to let his kids starve.
Yeah.
He's like one of the richest people on the planet. Um, but then, of course, he's not just blindly going to give him $10 billion. But the sort of first half of that statement, I think, is important, right? Um, Securing a certain baseline so then people can actually put in the work to focus on what's important.
Yeah, securing a certain baseline so that people can focus on what's important. Yeah, well, that's true. It's such an interesting dynamic, and I'm sure obviously you think about this having your own son now, but me even years out from wanting to have kids or anything, I do think about the concept of like what is giving your kids enough but not too much, right? In terms of like you want to give them enough to where they're not resentful or had to struggle too hard or traumatized, but you want to not give them too much to where they're spoiled and entitled and don't have that same drive or purpose, right? So I'm sure it's a interesting concept. Have you ever thought about that with your own son?
Yeah, I think every parent sort of faces that on a recurring basis. One of the realizations, and again, it's one of those things where I just try to learn a lot about it before even going into becoming a father, right? So obviously read a lot, consumed a lot of content. But especially at an early age, I mean, you cannot like be overly doting or affection. Like you cannot be too loving with a 2 year old. Like you know what I mean? So it really, as long as you still try to instill like good habits and good values and good behavior patterns, you're doing a good thing, right? Like whenever is age appropriate, they can start cleaning up after themselves and they can take the dishes back in the kitchen and they can do the things that they can do. Like when kids love to help, let them help even when they break things. That's one thing I had to learn. Let the toddler help,
Okay.
even if you have to clean it up afterwards.
Yeah, giving them
Because otherwise you're going to create a teenager who doesn't want to help.
Yeah, you don't want that. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So you think a lot of the habits of like teenagers, adults are learned before the age of 3. Like in the way that the parent interacts with the child at that very early age. Because I've heard people hypothesize, or maybe they're not even hypothesizing. Maybe this is like research done to back this up. But I've heard notions of like a lot of times a person has developed a lot of habits that will dictate who they are and who they become by the time they're age 4. Is there any?
So Jordan Peterson, which I'm guessing you're familiar with,
I
right?
believe I must have heard it from him. Yeah.
Jordan Peterson, he's a big proponent of this, where you have until the age of 3, maybe 4. If you screw certain things up by then, you really are going to be in dire straits moving forward. Fortunately, that concerns such fundamentals like being able to properly read social cues, no hitting, no kicking, no biting, semi-appropriate auto-regulation in the face of frustration and stress, right? That doesn't yet involve things like, I don't know, like delayed gratification or habits or anything crazy like that. So there's some value to that, right? So you definitely want to make sure that by the age of 3, 4, what you really want to have done is that your child can function appropriately in social settings, especially with peers. Because most of the socialization does take place among peers, right? You want to be able for a human being to read social cues. Like when is it appropriate to take somebody else's toy? Yeah. How do we enter a situation where 2 other or 3 other people are already playing, right? How can I sort of enter that space and do that in a way that makes everybody see that as a positive experience.
Yeah.
So those are certainly things that you want to do early on. But other than that, fortunately, our brains aren't fully formed until we're 25.
Yeah, always room to grow. Always room.
So, there's a lot of stuff that we can do. But sort of to bring this back to the starting point of that question, right? So get a handle on what it is that you're actually trying to improve, right? And you can soul search and ask yourself, why is this your purpose, or is this your sort of like passion project? You can certainly do that, but first of all, just like figure out what it is that you're actually trying to accomplish, and sort of in the big picture, why that is important to you in that moment.
Yeah.
If it is important at all, right? And that's sort of the first step before we can start thinking about becoming more productive and becoming more efficient with the way that we move through our day. One useful thing I think that people can do is sort of ask themselves, okay, well, if I look at myself, are these things that I'm doing representative of how I view myself as a human being and how I want other people to see me as a human being? Right? So, what is the identity that I want to portray, and how do the things I do day in, day out feed into me being able to enact that? And that can take different forms, right? So if your identity is, I want to be an involved father, well, you can't work 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
Your CEO job is out, right? So then the question is, okay, well, you can either choose not to want to be an involved father anymore, or you can choose not to work 80 hours a week, right? So those are then the questions that you have to ask yourself. Like, are your behaviors in line with your self-concept? That's really what it boils down to. And once you achieve that, then you can start thinking about optimizing those behaviors.
So doing the foundational work on yourself to then be able to define what you want to optimize,
Yeah.
why, ask if your current actions are in alignment with your identity, what you want to portray, who you want to be, and then after that optimize. So interesting, man. My perspective is that a lot of societies kind of, misery or depression is because they're not living in alignment with who they think they are, who their identity is, the identity they want to portray out. I'd imagine that's why a lot of people are unhappy, because they're not living in accordance with, who they want to be. But those are powerful points, man. So you think those are the biggest, 2 to 3 things that need to be done?
I think so. And of course it's difficult. I mean, by time we get to a point where we're independent enough to make those decisions, that's also the point in time where we've layered years and decades of external expectations and external input onto our core self, right? So I'm 36 now, I'll turn 37 in August. That's a lot of years in terms of having internalized what the world wants me to be.
Yeah.
And like how other people want me to act, and how what I believe to be true about me might not even truly be representative of my deepest self, but it might just be some sort of fractured version of what other people have been telling me over the years, right? So it's kind of paradoxical that way, that by the time we actually get to make those decisions for ourselves, we first have to sort of do a lot of digging and a lot of peeling away the layers of all that stuff that has been sort of deposited on that deep identity, right? And I mean, there are psychologists that claim that there is no such thing as like your true self. like it's all just a collective mishmash of, all the different things that you've internalized over the years that other people want you to be, and what society wants you to look like, and what the collective wants you to think, and all that stuff. So you can
Yeah, that makes sense, right? That just based off of all the different things we've seen and taken in over the course of years, that there's no true, like at the deepest core level self. But I don't know, man. I mean, I've been on a journey of kind of doing meditation and a couple of other things that have allowed me to at least increase my self awareness in terms of like, are these things that came from me? Are these motivations that come truly from me, intrinsic motivators as opposed to extrinsic motivators brought on by either society itself, my peers, or my parents? A quick example could be I was studying finance in undergrad right off the bat because, one of the only people in my family that went to college. He got his MBA with a focus in finance. He was a controller, at an oil company. So that's all I knew. That's what he told me I should do to secure my financial stability. And upon, further research, further self-development, I pivoted to another direction, which is the direction I'm on now. But it just takes a lot of time to peel back those layers and really find out like what's all the baggage I'm carrying, what's all the external expectation on my own identity that I placed, and like who really am I. But I'm hopeful that um, people can do that. They can find who they really are and take those layers off. Because I feel like I've done it to a certain extent, and obviously we're all a work in progress, still have a way to go. But I know through certain tools I've discovered it a little bit better. Are there any tools that you recommend for people to be able to ask those deeper questions?
Meditation. So I also meditate daily.
Cool.
So it's so cliche, right? Like every single
Mhm.
high performer in whatever field you might look at will most likely mention some form of contemplative practice, right? So they can be sitting meditation, they can be walking meditation, they can be different types of meditation, within those formats, but you are most likely to find some sort of contemplative practice, to the point where it's become this like wild cliche almost, right? And also, somewhat ironically, since the origins of meditative practice are anything but the pursuit of performance enhancement,
Yeah.
right? It's the sort of like the dialing back of that performative drive and just the being, and really not doing it to become better at
Yeah,
doing stuff, right?
detaching the expectation from the actual practice. That's something I struggled with for so long with meditation, and I still do struggle with it at times. It's like I want to be better focused. I want to be more at peace. I want to be happier through doing this practice, and I realize that it hinders the practice itself
Yeah.
because I'm doing it for those reasons. So it's an interesting journey. What kind of meditation do you do, if you don't mind me quickly asking?
So I use the Calm app.
Okay.
They have, obviously tons and
Mm.
hundreds. And this is actually my third time using the app. That's what I started out originally years ago, used it for a long time. Started using a different app. Then I just did it without any sort of guidance. And now I'm back with the app. And this is also something to anybody who's trying to get into meditation. Give it the time to find the type and the guidance that really works for you.
For sure.
Right. So what I do right now, it's a guided meditation by Tara Brach. It's very free flowing, very much a sort of just awareness based, taking in that sensory momentary experience, just sitting still with whatever thoughts arise. So there's no breathing to it. It's not one of those like super focused, like it's not like a box breathing thing, or like like visualizing a candle or anything like that. There's no mantra. It's very much a sort of like, okay, how am I experiencing like this very present moment?
Mm.
So that's the one that I use.
Sounds cool, man. It sounds relaxing in terms of like it's more contemplated, mindfulness based. You don't have to like try to focus on your breath or keep repeating a mantra. I've tried a mantra where you repeat a phrase, and then I've tried the breath focused one, which is the one I've done the most by far in terms of like just focusing on my breath, my sensations, and then trying to achieve a mindful meditative state through that. And I've also done the one, not that specific one with Brock, but I've also done just that style, right, where it's kind of like just a contemplative practice in terms of like just being mindful of your experience in that moment. But yeah, man, no, this is super helpful advice, very powerful stuff. I feel like I'm, actually running a powerful podcast right here with having you on, in terms of the knowledge within your space from the financial and sports management stuff all the way onto the performance psychology, man. I know I took a lot of value from this, Dr. H. I'm sure a lot of other people will. I'm excited to put this out, man. But real quick, because this is what we started off with, any last advice for those wanting to pursue careers in sports management or, studies in it?
Similar to really anything else that sort of in this that's in the sphere of somebody paying you for your services, get really good at it, at whatever it might be, right? And make yourself indispensable, I think is a good way of putting it, right? So you want people to have a reason to keep you around. That can be your content knowledge, that can be your contribution to the workspace, that can be your network, that can be your connections, that can be your energy. But you want to give an organization a reason to want to have you around for the long term, right? And to get to that point, it sucks, but it goes back to just, the signaling of, credentials. You need a degree, you need internships, you need to know people, you need to network, right? In that sense, the sport industry really is not all that different from other industries. You're not going to get hired because you're a sports fan. That's a sad reality, right?
Sure. Yeah, the sad reality a lot of people have to come to terms with. It's just like, just because you're an avid fan, the most diehard fan, a passionate fan, does not mean that you are a good hire. Yes. So yeah.
And know what you want to get into, and also know what it takes to get there, right? In sports, a lot of the paths lead through sales. So you can make for yourself that decision that you don't like sales. For example, I would not have been able to thrive in any type of sales position. Mm-hmm. And I know that about myself. But the question is, okay, well, if 60, 70% of the entry-level jobs in the industry are sales, well, you're going to learn how to be good at sales, or you're going to hope that the other 20, 30% are there for you, you to pick up. That's a question you have to ask yourself, right?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Very valuable stuff, ladies and gents. Dr. H, great time, man. I know we had only scheduled for an hour, but we went over 2 hours. Just the knowledge was too good, man. But thank you, my man. Fun time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Don't be such a smart aleck.